Number 7. 44 stabs. At approximately 10 p.m. on January 16, 1997, 43-year-old Scott Falater stabbed his wife Yarmila Falater 44 times before drowning her in their swimming pool. To this day, he claims to have no memory of the incident and insists he was sleepwalking. The culprit and the victim, both devout Mormons, seemed to be a normal couple on the surface. They had been married for over 2 decades, and their son Michael Falater, who was 12 years old at the time, claims he had a happy childhood. According to Scott, the day of the incident went like any other. He went to work, came home to have dinner with his wife and 2 children, prepared a lesson plan for the religious class he taught every morning, and tried to fix the pool filter at around 9 p.m. He then found his wife asleep on the couch, kissed her goodnight and headed for bed. In his own words, this was the last time he saw her alive. A couple hours later, Scott would awaken at the top of the stairs with a police officer aiming a gun at him and telling him to get on the ground. A detective would later tell him that his wife was dead and that he was the prime suspect. Scott said he had no memory of the incident, although his neighbor Greg Coons paints a different picture. He and his girlfriend Stephanie Reedhead were settling into bed at 10 p.m. when they heard someone crying in pain next door. In later testimony, Greg revealed that he saw the victim barely moving on the lawn, followed by Scott dragging her to the pool and holding her head under the water. He then called 911, and police arrived on the scene to find Yarmila's lifeless body floating in the pool. The water dyed red with her blood. When detectives questioned him, Scott kept repeating that Yarmila was a good wife, that she did not deserve to die, and that he had no idea what happened. He apparently did not even know that there was blood on his neck, and officers had no choice but to take him into custody and charge him with first-degree homicide. An autopsy indicated that most of the 44 cuts on her body were defensive wounds, with some deeper stabs, and that the cause of death was drowning. During the trial, Scott's lawyer made his mother, Lois Welchek, and sister Laura Healy take the stand. That's when they told the jury about his history of sleepwalking. It turned out that Scott had sleepwalked several times during his life, including an incident where he was walking around fully naked, and a separate encounter where he grabbed his sister and tossed her aside. Much like the encounter that led to his wife's death, Scott could not remember what he had done the next day. 2 of Scott's cellmates testified that they saw him sleepwalking as well, but the jury was not convinced of his innocence. They declared him guilty in 1999, and the judge, convinced by a string of character witnesses, decided to sentence him to life instead of the death penalty. Even now, over 20 years later, Scott is adamant that he did not intentionally murder his wife. He feels a deep sense of shame for what he did, admitting that her death was entirely his fault, but still claims he was sleepwalking the whole time. In the end, this bizarre incident deprived 2 children of both their parents. Michael says he often thinks of his mother and the life they could have led, but he also still considers Scott his father and continues to visit him in prison. Number 6. Night terrors made real. In July 2008, 59-year-old Brian Thomas had a sudden night terror that resulted in him strangling his wife, 57-year-old Christine, to death. The couple were celebrating 40 years of marriage by driving around Wales in a camper van, eventually parking in the sleepy seaside village of Aberporth for the night. They usually slept in separate rooms due to Brian's tendency to sleepwalk, but the lack of space forced them to share a bed during the holiday. At around 11:30 p.m., a gang of rowdy boy racers woke the couple up, and they seemed to leave a lasting impact on Brian's mind. He would later have a nightmare in which one of these boys tried to break into the van, forcing him to attack the intruder. Little did he know, his fingers were actually wrapped around his wife's neck, and by the time he woke up, it was already too late. He made a terrified phone call to the police, confessing that his wife was dead by his own hand. Authorities did not believe the night terror story at first, but after hearing friends of the couple confirm how healthy their relationship was, they began to suspect that Thomas was telling the truth. The prosecution's own psychiatrist accepted the claims, and the jury was compelled to hand out a not guilty verdict. This was a small comfort to Brian, however, who has to live with the fact that he strangled his childhood sweetheart. Number 5. Punch, kicked and stamped to death. In October 2003, 32-year-old Jules Lowe entered a sleepwalking state after a night of heavy drinking and assaulted his father, 83-year-old Edward Lowe. The attack led to the victim suffering 90 injuries, and he soon died of his wounds. Edward, a resident of Manchester, England, was not able to make it far, eventually collapsing outside his home where he was spotted by a neighbor. As she frantically called the police, Jules, supposedly still sleepwalking, casually cleaned up the scene of the crime and lay down to sleep. Though he did not deny attacking his father, Jules told authorities that the last thing he remembered was drinking the previous night. Jurors were initially skeptical when the alleged culprit and his lawyer gave the sleepwalking defense, especially considering the prolonged nature of the attack. Jules seemed to have punched, kicked and stamped on the victim for several minutes, even dragging his body across the floor at one point. Additionally, he had previously assaulted a police officer after consuming alcohol, clearly showing a pattern of violent behavior. He had to submit to medical tests, which confirmed the sleepwalking issue, giving him a legal reprieve. Experts testified that he was in a state of automatism during the incident, and a jury cleared him of all charges on March 18, 2005. Number 4. 15-mile drive. On May 24, 1987, 24-year-old Kenneth Parks drove 15 miles to the home of his mother-in-law in Scarborough, Ontario, and beat her to death with a tire iron. He went on to stab her corpse repeatedly before attempting to strangle his father-in-law. After waking up and seeing his blood-covered hands, he drove to a nearby police station and confessed the whole thing. It was not until the trial that he claimed he had been sleepwalking, though expert testimony would later clarify that he was telling the truth. Perhaps the strangest aspect of this case was the clear sign of premeditation. The victim, 42-year-old Barbara Woods, had apparently trusted Parks enough to give him a spare key to their home. The culprit intentionally picked up these keys, navigated 15 miles of traffic, and committed an extreme act of violence, all while he was asleep. This was one of the first modern instances of homicide while sleeping, and the case ended up going all the way to the Canadian Supreme Court. 5 neurologists provided testimony during the trial, each of whom confirmed that Parks was in fact asleep during the incident. One doctor stated that he was suffering from a sleep disorder, and as a result, Kenneth was deemed not guilty for reason of insanity. While all of this was going on, he faced separate charges for fraud after stealing $30,000 from an employer to pay off his gambling debts. He pleaded guilty to these charges, paid full restitution, and went on to run for public office in 2006. Number 3. The Homicidal Holiday. On October 1, 2001, 28-year-old Stephen Reitz woke up to find his girlfriend, 42-year-old Eva Marie Weinfruter, brutally mutilated. He had no idea that he was the one that committed the violence. The couple were enjoying a relaxing holiday on the idyllic Santa Catalina Island when Stephen realized he had forgotten the medication for his bipolar disorder at home. Eva allegedly gave him some anti-anxiety meds to compensate, but when they started drinking and consuming illicit substances that night, the toxic combination made him lose his grip on reality. Stephen suddenly turned violent, smashing a flower pot repeatedly against the victim's skull and stabbing her in the neck 3 times with a pocket knife. According to the autopsy report, Eva apparently had a shattered skull, a dislocated shoulder, a puncture wound from a plastic fork, fractures on her wrists, ribs, face and jaw, as well as the gaping holes in her neck. Stephen claimed that he had been dreaming about fending off an attacker, and that he only realized what he had done when he woke up. He was working as a commercial fisherman at the time, and he pointed out that the cuts were reminiscent of the ones he used to butcher sharks. However, many of the victim's loved ones had noticed mysterious bruises on her body in the months prior, with her sister Joyce Dean suggesting that Stephen had been abusive towards her. Though Stephen and his lawyer tried to convince the jury that he had not acted intentionally, they were ultimately convinced by the graphic crime scene photos. He was sentenced to 26 years to life on July 28, 2004. Do you agree with the jury's verdict? Let us know in the comments and hit subscribe while you're at it. Number 2. The Teen's Living Nightmare. On May 18, 2009, 13-year-old Daniel Gudinho shot his younger brother, 9-year-old Ulysses Gudinho, before shooting his mother and stabbing her with a knife and a pair of scissors. Apparently, the teenager slept through the whole incident. 38-year-old Maria Gudinho, a mother of 4, was getting breakfast ready while Daniel slept on the couch. Unbeknownst to her, he got up at some point, picked the lock to the gun safe, and took out a loaded .22 caliber rifle. As she worked in the kitchen, she looked up to see her son pointing the weapon at her. After revealing he had already shot his brother, Daniel fired a bullet straight into his mother's shoulder. He then grabbed a knife and a pair of scissors and stabbed at her wildly, screaming that he wanted to kill her before collapsing in her arms. The culprit's mother wanted to go check on her youngest son, but she had to inform the police first. She later claimed that Daniel appeared perfectly normal prior to the incident, and that his face seemed oddly blank and expressionless while he attacked her. When an officer later asked where he wanted to aim the bullet, he pointed to his forehead, indicating that he intended to take his mother's life, despite being in a dreamlike state. Marina survived the encounter, but she was utterly devastated when she learned the fate of her younger boy. The unbelievable nature of the incident aside, all the evidence pointed to Daniel being the sole culprit. His trial began on May 3, 2010, and the first order of business was to decide if he should be tried as an adult. The perpetrator claimed that he had seen 2 ghosts right before he fell asleep, and that he later dreamed of going to his brother's room, where he tried to shoot the shadowy figures. Dr. John Hardy, an expert witness at the trial, concluded that he suffered from parasomnia, a rare sleep disorder that can lead to sleepwalking and hallucinations, and that he did not show criminal intent during the incident. Daniel was eventually convicted for the attempted homicide of his mother on April 6, 2011, nearly 2 years after his living nightmare began. He pleaded guilty to the reduced charge of criminally negligent homicide for the death of his brother, and he was sentenced to 5 years in a youth detention center. Number 1. The Cough Medicine Killer. On September 1st, 2017, 29-year-old Matthew James Phelps, a resident of Raleigh, North Carolina, woke up from a cough medicine-induced haze and realized he had stabbed his wife 123 times. Reports indicate that he may have been inspired by the homicidal protagonist of American Psycho. He called 911 at around 1:10 a.m., hesitantly admitting that he might be responsible, and that the last thing he remembered was taking Coricidin cough and cold before bed. Police arrived to find the victim, 28-year-old Lauren Hugelmayer Phelps, curled up dead on the bathroom floor. Her body had been pierced so many times that she barely looked human anymore. Matthew, who had cleaned up himself before the police came, was taken into custody, and an investigation was launched to get to the bottom of the unbelievable violence. Police soon discovered that the couple had been going through a rough patch, even though they had been only married for under a year. An aspiring pastor, Matthew was allegedly spending more money than the couple earned, and his wife, a Sunday school teacher and a pharmaceutical auditor, was struggling to make ends meet. As a result, she was planning to end the relationship, and there is a chance that Matthew ended her life in revenge. Further investigation revealed that Matthew had a secret Instagram account where he showed a chilling obsession with the movie American Psycho, particularly its bloodthirsty protagonist. The account featured numerous stills of the movie, as well as images of Matthew dressed as Patrick Bateman. According to an unnamed friend, he even confessed that he was curious what it felt like to take a life. The evidence seemed to suggest that Matthew was not the happy-go-lucky pastor he claimed to be, and that he was hiding some truly dark urges under the surface. After initially claiming innocence, Matthew eventually pled guilty to first-degree homicide on October 5, 2018. The charge implies premeditation, so he might have been using the cough medicine as an alibi at first, although the surreal 911 call after 123 stabs suggests that he was in his senses. Regardless, Matthew was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He admitted to feeling like a monster for what he did, and based on his open admission of guilt, it appears he was willing to face the consequences for his brutal act. Which of these crazy sleepwalkers shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time on Bad Badger.